The United States cannot bully China. This means that basically the Western-led geopolitical order is over. And this is the change of geopolitical power.
For years, we have been told that the best way to slow China's rise was through economic pressure. The United States imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, restricted access to advanced technology, and encouraged companies to move their factories out of China. The idea was simple. If China lost access to the American market, its economy would eventually slow down. Many people believe that would actually happen. After all, the United States is the world's largest economy, and for decades, it has been one of China's biggest export markets. But years later, the outcome doesn't look quite like many had expected. China remains the world's largest manufacturing nation and continues to trade with countries across Asia, Africa, Middle East, Latin America, and beyond. So that raises an important question. Has America's strategy actually worked? Or has the world changed more than many people realize? Recently, economist Jeffrey Sachs shared his thoughts on this topic, arguing that the United States cannot stop China's development and that the global balance of power is shifting. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
The United States cannot bully China. It has tried. It tried as recently as 6 months ago. It put on 100% tariffs against China, expecting China to get down on its knees and beg for mercy to Mr. Trump. And China said, okay, 100%, and we'll raise you 20%. And the United States said, okay, and we'll raise you export bans on microprocessors. And China said, and we will raise you with export bans on rare earth magnets, which I had never heard of before, but then discovered that every major industrial process needs them. And the United States backed down within about 48 hours. And that's the new geopolitical scene. We have several great powers: the United States, Russia, China, India, are 4 nuclear superpowers. They are not at equal level of strength in different dimensions. The United States still has a global reach that is unique because it has military bases in 80 countries around the world, and because the U.S. dollar is used for about 60% of settlements of international transactions. But these are evanescent remaining advantages because the core point is that the United States does not dominate the world economy or world trade. And when Mr. Trump put on protectionist barriers, there were a few countries totally freaked out, such as Canada and Mexico, because their entire economy is oriented towards the U.S. market, about 80% of their exports. But for Africa, the U.S. market represents about 8% of Africa's exports. For China, about 12%. It's not to shrug off, but it's not to obsess about either. And this is the change of geopolitical power. In my view, there are no choke points, military or technological or geographic, that gives the U.S. any decisive advantage over China in the world. China cannot stop, U.S. cannot stop China's development. And this means that basically the Western-led geopolitical order is over. And Donald Trump is home in Washington today because he's having a temper tantrum. That's the only reason. Because he wants to be number one, but can't be anymore. Not that the U.S. is threatened or in danger or losing security or suffering from China or anything of the sort, but it just can't demand that everybody does what it wants.
Professor Jeffrey Sachs makes a point that often gets overlooked. He argues that the United States cannot simply stop China's development. At first glance, that might sound controversial. But when you look at how the global economy works today, it becomes easier to understand why. Take tariffs, for example. When the US first imposed tariffs on Chinese imports in 2018, the expectation was straightforward. Higher prices would make Chinese products less competitive, companies would move production elsewhere, China's exports would decline. Instead, something more complicated happened. While some factories relocated to countries like Vietnam, Mexico, and India, many Chinese companies adapted rather than disappeared. Some shifted parts of their supply chains overseas. Others focused on higher value manufacturing. And many simply found new customers outside the United States. In fact, China's trade with Southeast Asia has grown significantly over the past decade, with ASEAN becoming one of China's largest trading partners. Trade with countries in the Middle East and Latin America has also expanded rapidly. In other words, China didn't respond by relying even more on the American market. It responded by relying less on it. That's an important difference. One reason this strategy was possible is because today's world is no longer centered around a single market. 30 years ago, access to the US and Western Europe was often the key to global economic success. But today, the picture is much more diversified. Emerging economies account for a growing share of global growth. Countries are trading more with each other, not just with the West. This doesn't mean the American market isn't important. Of course, it is still very important, but it is no longer the only game in town. Professor Jeffrey Sachs also mentions China's restrictions on rare earth exports. This is another reminder that economic dependence works both ways. Rare earth elements are essential for products ranging from smartphones and electric vehicles to wind turbines, fighter jets, and missile guidance systems. Although rare earth minerals exist in several countries, China dominates the processing and refining industry. That means even if other countries mine these materials, many still rely on Chinese facilities to turn them into usable products. When Beijing tightened export controls on certain rare earth materials, it demonstrated that supply chains can create leverage for both sides. The US can restrict advanced chip, China can restrict critical minerals. Neither country holds all the cards. And that's something many people underestimated at the beginning of the trade war. Perhaps the biggest takeaway from Professor Jeffrey Sachs' comments is that economic development ultimately comes from within. China's growth wasn't built only because American companies bought Chinese products. It was also built through decades of investments in infrastructure, education, manufacturing, research, and technology. Every year, China graduates hundreds of thousands of engineers and invests heavily in industries like EV, renewable energy, AI, robotics, and high-speed rail. Whether people admire China's model or criticize it, those domestic investments cannot simply be erased by tariffs alone. Another interesting point Sachs raises is the idea that we are witnessing the end of a Western-led era. Now, this doesn't mean the US is suddenly becoming weak. The US remains one of the world's most innovative economies and continues to lead in many advanced technology. But compared to 30 or 40 years ago, global economic power is far more spread out today. Asia accounts for a much larger share of global GDP than it once did. Countries like China and India have become major engines of global growth. Meanwhile, organizations like BRICS have expanded, giving emerging economies a larger voice in international affairs. The world is becoming increasingly multipolar, and that makes it much harder for any single country to shape global economic outcomes on its own. Jeffrey Sachs also argues that the United States has become increasingly protectionist. This is quite a shift when you think about it. For decades, Washington promoted free trade around the world. Today, tariffs, industrial subsidies, export controls, and domestic manufacturing incentives have become central parts of American economic policy. Supporters argue these measures protect national security and create jobs. Critics argue they raise costs and reduce competition. Either way, it's a sign that the global trading system is changing. Finally, Professor Sachs also challenges another common assumption that China's rise automatically makes it a threat. His view is that much of the current rivalry stems from America's desire to remain the world's dominant power. Of course, not everyone agree with this interpretation. Many governments have concerns about security, military modernization, technology, and regional influence. Those concerns are real and continue to shape international relations today. But Jeffrey Sachs' broader point is that competition doesn't have to mean inevitable confrontation. A rising China and a strong United States don't necessarily have to exist in a zero-sum world. Whether you agree with Jeffrey Sachs or not, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The world is changing. China is no longer relying on just one market, and the global economy is no longer centered around a single country. That doesn't mean the United States is no longer important. Far from it. But it does mean the rules of the game are changing. So, what do you think? Has the US strategy toward China worked? Or is the world becoming more multipolar than ever before? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bells so you won't miss our future discussions on global affairs. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.